Good day. And soon to be happy St. Patty's Day to all students and teachers representing Unit 5 from the We the People program, as well as a hearty welcome to the constitutionally curious as we delve into and discuss the constitutional questions and controversies surrounding the policy of affirmative action. I personally extend my wholehearted good luck to both students and teachers addressing this question, because after many attempts in evaluating the question, I just can't figure out how it relates to the theme of the unit, which is what rights does the Bill of Rights protect? Now, I know I am the weakest link amongst the FOPs, but I have committed nearly 40 years of my life to understanding and teaching the Constitution with all its ambiguities, fuzziness, and outright contradictions. And given that, I am pretty sure that the Equal Protection Clause is not part of the Bill of Rights, and that, in fact, there is no lesson in Unit 5 that deals with this clause, let alone the policy of affirmative action. Students are also asked in this question to deal with the issue of precedent or stare decisis within the federal courts, which, once again, I cannot find a lesson within Unit 5 that helps guide students in their understanding of this concept. Now, in all fairness, there are lessons within other units that do deal with the 14th Amendment issues and the structure and function of the federal courts. And it isn't a bad idea to provide motivation for students to always expand their knowledge and cross-pollinate, as some of us say, and learning a lot about other units in this. However, I believe that if we are going to do this for Unit 5, we should probably ask all students, irrespective of their unit assignments, to address topics clearly outside their unit of study, like asking Unit 2 to deal, I don't know, with pure democracy or the initiative process. So maybe that's what we should be doing. I don't know, some topics. And they could be led by Professor Tim Moore in their more recent elements of constitutional government there. But then again, what do I know? So once again, good luck to students and teachers. I can optimistically say to you that our panel of FOPs will do everything they can to bring to light the history, philosophy, and legal principles that provide the foundation of understanding for affirmative action policies in American society. So let's go back to the beginning, as we generally like to do, and ask our resident 18th, 19th century expert from Western Pennsylvania, Professor Tim Melanchthon Smith Moore, to start us off. Professor Moore, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that affirmative action clearly emanates from the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. What weaknesses and shortcomings of the original Constitution made the creation of the 14th Amendment, and specifically the Equal Protection Clause, necessary?
Well, I think the weakness of the original Constitution, we could slightly rephrase it like, why do we have a 14th? And I think I don't know that the original Constitution was particularly weak on this, but there's a lot of things that justify why we have that go into why we have this 14th. I mean, there are some people that say that the 14th Amendment completes Madison's Constitution. And I think Chris has referenced this in many occasions that we've been together, that Madison wanted to restrict the states in proposing his Bill of Rights. And so in some ways, it completes the Constitution as originally, it completes the Bill of Rights as Madison originally thought the Bill of Rights should do. I think there's another couple reasons why we could consider the 14th, why, mommy, where did the 14th Amendment come from? Well, first of all, it overturned Dred Scott. Dred Scott said that in the future, African Americans would never be citizens. So very early in the 14th Amendment, that comes out. It also is because I think there's some deficiencies in the 13th Amendment in terms of defining what freedmen now, what's their status. I mean, the 13th Amendment essentially ends slavery, but that's about it. And consequently, the inadequacy to define status in the 13th leads to Southern black codes, and where there's all kinds of shenanigans that occur in state constitutions that are being rushed, that are very rapidly being rewritten, as per Andrew Johnson's suggestion. So black codes were highly discriminatory against African Americans. And so the 14th, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, they kind of go hand in hand. I would say the 14th Amendment is much more broad in its potential meaning than the Civil Rights Act of 66 was. So in a sense, maybe we have a 14th Amendment because the Civil Rights Act of 66 wasn't as broad as some of the folks would liked it to have been. I think we have a 14th Amendment largely because early federalism practices emphasized the states more so than the national government. I mean, the classic there is when the court was faced with a rights decision in the 30s, 1830s, Baron Baltimore. The meaning of the Bill of Rights had no meaning because it said Congress shall make no laws, and so states, the rights didn't apply in the Bill of Rights to the state level. I think another reason we have a 14th Amendment is because there's, and this kind of ties in with state sovereignty kind of thinking, is that we have a limited powers government. And so therefore, if you want to really emphasize that this Constitution, the national Constitution, is a limited powers system, limited powers of the national government, what that by default means that states have a broad berth of what they can do. And Madison noticed that states were the problem in the 1780s. And I think as the country moves west, and every time we acquire land, the issue of slavery comes up. Does slavery go in the West? And so this idea of states being in how federalism worked, states being emphasized over nation, I think that also plays into why we have a 14th Amendment. But and I would say at the end of the Civil War, it clearly answers the question textually, not in practice, but it clearly textually answers the question like that state sovereignty. Well, it answers the question of who's sovereign in a constitutional sense, with the no state shall provisions, which is word for word what Madison wanted back as he proposed the Bill of Rights. So I think there's a lot of reasons we have a 14th Amendment: historical, legal, practice, why we have this. And in the black codes, there's tremendous discrimination that takes place. I mean, there's discrimination against poor whites as well, but the discrimination that African Americans, freed slaves, faced is clearly, I think, related to the Equal Protection Clause, that cannot be deprived of citizens in the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th.
I guess I need some clarification. At the beginning, did you say that that this is not a reflection of a weakness? That there was not a weakness in the Constitution that had to be addressed? Is that my understanding?
Well, if you say, yeah, I said that, and I guess my thought would be, if the Constitution doesn't say something explicitly, I'm not sure I'm willing to concede that that's a weakness. Now, subsequent history will bear that out, that it is. But I don't think it's now. If you'd asked Madison when he wanted his Bill of Rights and he didn't get what he wanted, ironically, his 14th suggestion, he would have said that. But I think overall, because there was no statement about that, I don't perceive that as a weakness.
You don't see any,
and I'll concede that that's an arguable point. But silence doesn't mean weakness.
well, you don't see some inconsistency wherein, our founding document, the Declaration, clearly points out the equality of mankind, yet in our founding charter of law, we find no reference to that. You don't see a problem there, or at least an inconsistency?
That assumes the Declaration is a constitutional statement.
No,
which
but it is a statement of who we are.
Yeah, but that doesn't equal constitution. I'm more prone to say people create constitutions rather than constitutions create people. So So I mean, I'll concede that this is a highly debatable point, but my view of it is that to invoke the Declaration there, um, I'm not willing to wholeheartedly buy that.
Chris?
In a practical sense too, Madison wanted that provision in the body of the Constitution, which he did not get, and Tim alluded to he doesn't get in the Bill of Rights either, because he believed. But again, you've got to get the Constitution ratified. And there's a reason in Philadelphia in 1787 they're not willing to budge that because the states aren't going to ratify it if you give this
Yeah.
national government or a consolidated government the power to run roughshod over the states.
Yeah.
So there's a practical political nature of trying to put something like that in that document in 1787, but the due process.
Well, in 89 too, because there's no way in heck that would have
Yeah.
gotten through the Senate.
Yeah,
I
you're
mean,
not going to.
the anti-federalists were screaming about this Constitution obliterates states. Well, if he'd have got the 14th statement that he wanted in his Bill of Rights, all heck would have broke loose when those old anti-federalists claiming, see, we told you. So I think to Chris's point, there's a practical matter as to why, quote, Madison's failure to get his 14th. I think there's a practical matter that is, I think it's Chris's point is very prescient.
Well, and I want to go to Mike here for a second, but just real quickly, I think we need to separate out here in the sense that I would agree with you on the 14th Amendment, but the Equal Protection Clause, I think, is problematical. That you could have had maybe in the preamble, some statement of human equality in the preamble, all right, which, questionably has any legal standing or not. So I think separating out the 14th Amendment, but the statement of human equality is something worth talking about. Mike, you wanted to add?
Okay.
Well, isn't that Roosevelt's point about equality at the second founding? Mike and Chris have been mentioning Kermit Roosevelt's book on this. Yeah.
Mike?
Christy, I'm sorry. Do you want to follow up, Chris?
No, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, because I was actually just gonna hold up his book. I mean, we've done it before, because it seems. I mean, it seems to me this debate about how do we square? Does the 14th Amendment complete a weakness? How do we square it? That's Roosevelt's argument, which I find refreshing. I don't know if I agree with it completely, but he would basically say we have to stop having this argument. Like, we have to treat the 14th Amendment as a new founding, and we're the heirs of that founding. And as Tim alluded to, it's not only the Equal Protection Clause, it's the whole system of federalism is turned on its head in a way that the founders would not recognize it. So that's not our narrative, though. We're trying to square it in a way that Roosevelt would argue we shouldn't be trying. Like, if we just would give up that argument, it wouldn't be good for Tim, because then everything Tim's doing is like, okay, well, I guess this is the first republic, which, so I'm not saying I completely agree with that, of course, but I just think that there's a way out of this argument that's a little more radical.
Well, if the French historians can deal with multiple republics, I think Tim can deal with a couple.
I don't know. I don't know.
Man. I mean, look at that heater behind him. I don't know if he can deal with things.
Well, and the other what I'm going to go back to, David, I think
You go ahead, Chris.
No, sorry, your point is well made about that. But again, there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So, what's the purpose of this government? The blueprints laid out in the preamble, and liberty, or the whole idea of preservation of liberty. Well, who is going to be doing that? The states are going to be doing that. And even when you get the Bill of Rights ratified, in 1789, and as Tim alluded to, Barron v. Baltimore, Justice Marshall's decision that the Bill of Rights only protect you from the national government, not from the state government. So that where equality is going to be fought for is at the state level. It's not going to be on the federal level. Should it have been? Maybe, but the 14th Amendment is, I always like to think of the 14th Amendment, and that language you're alluding to is actually a bridge to the Declaration of Independence.
Right, but again, you just said, where is liberty going to be fought for? It's going to be fought for in the states here. So why not have the same thing for equality? Why not a statement in the preamble? All right, similar to the blessings of liberty is the sanctity of human equality.
Well, because
we have slavery. I mean, I don't know. That seems to be, you know, the 800-pound gorilla in the corner on this. You start talking about equality. I mean, some of the back in the founding, there were some states that were quite nervous about some preambles before their bills of rights would make statements about the inherent equality of people, and Southerners were like, "Whoa, wait a minute! We're not quite comfortable with those kinds of preambles to our bills of rights." Because of the implications that it meant. So, I mean, slavery bleeds into everything, it seems to me, on this question of
And,
equality.
and honestly, Tim, you saying that makes me think of the Quock Walker cases out of Massachusetts, because Chief Justice Cushing, in his opinions there, is relying on the preamble of the Massachusetts State Constitution on the
Yep.
very notion.
Yeah, I forgot that. It's a good point. Yeah.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, again, I'm probably wrong, but it seems to me that clearly the Equal Protection Clause was an intent to provide the equality of opportunity for all Americans, regardless of race. How, if at all, does affirmative action further that goal? And why, by the late 1960s, did many, like President Johnson, find affirmative action necessary?
Well, I want to make sure the students understand this, and I think we've talked about this before, but the wording, you know, in section 1, there are two parts: privileges and immunities of citizenship, which is huge, very huge. And I know this is not, we're not going to necessarily get into that in this program, but in the next clause, all persons are entitled to due process and equal protection of the laws. So to make sure the students, you're paying attention to that whole idea of privileges and immunities. There are a lot of scholars have been writing about trying to bring that back. I'm glad they're finally coming around to some logical ways of thinking, and revisiting perhaps the slaughterhouse rulings that killed it in its crib, so to speak. Which actually leads me to your question, David, and I would go to the case of Cruikshank, because when the 14th Amendment is ratified, I think many of the framers of the 14th Amendment, including Bingham from Ohio, the primary author of Section 1, believed that the Bill of Rights would apply to the states as well. But in the case of Cruikshank, the Supreme Court ruled that, well, no, it doesn't protect individuals from private action, right? And it's not going to protect people from discrimination at the state level necessarily. And this is why we get into the whole process of selective incorporation. And so you don't start to see the Bill of Rights and these people being protected equally under the law until we get into what, the 1960s? I mean, because honestly, if you think about case law, when do you start seeing some of these things? Now, you get some isolated cases, perhaps like interstate bus lines in the 1940s. You get some other case law from on individual cases, but then again, it's up to the federal government to enforce that. And clearly, the government's not necessarily enforcing some of these. I'm not going to call them outlier rulings, but they're not necessarily enforcing some of these rulings that we don't know much about, because there's been not a lot of debate about it. So the reason it takes to the night why we required affirmative action is because of racism in America. I mean, not only racism, but sexism. So we focus on race, but we forget about one of the largest recipients of affirmative action programs have been women in terms of percentages. So when you think about the history of the United States is a history of racism and sexism, or of overcoming racism and sexism. So when the court makes these early rulings about the application of the 14th Amendment, it's not really protecting people from private action. And you think about, go fast forward to the Heart of Atlanta motel case, right? And what was that? Gosh, help me out, guys.
65, maybe?
So
No,
mid-60s.
it's the same.
Yeah.
It's actually 64, I believe.
Okay. So we're still talking the mid-60s before we see the government stepping in and stopping private actors from discriminating against people on the basis of race, because court rulings are going to say it only protects you from government action. And the same thing is true for women. So it's taken us a long time to get to that point. And here's the thing. Tim made a great point about the first part of the 14th Amendment. I love this for students, because if you think about the 13th Amendment, you're no longer enslaved, right? But the Constitution has not wrapped its arms around you. You are actually, there's about 4 million people living in this country that are outside of the Constitution, not to mention Native Americans, because they are not protected. The 14th Amendment wraps its arms around these people by making these formerly enslaved people citizens. So the whole concept of actually getting them in there, so the concept is, okay, slavery's abolished, war's over, North wins. Now the Constitution says, oh, you have the same opportunities as everybody else. Well, you can't have the same opportunity if you're 100 yards behind the starting line. You simply just cannot. Tim, Tim looks like he's about ready.
I think David's question is provocative, actually, as we've fully expected his questions to be. But I wonder whether, I think you kind of phrased it like, is Johnson over his skis in interpreting the Equal Protection Clause to mean affirmative action? Well, I don't know that it's just Johnson. I think, the way I recall all this, there's always been a struggle as to what does equal protection mean, going back to Cruikshank. Yick Wo is another one of those. What does equality mean? In the legacy leading up to Brown v. Board, I don't know that we can go after Johnson for interpreting the meaning of the 14th Amendment's equal protection here, because that's been a struggle since its inception. If that makes any sense.
And I say that there are many, including President Johnson, and he kind of kickstarts, I think, a national policy approach. The question is, and I think you bring that up, is what is the connective tissue of affirmative action to this Equal Protection Clause and equality of opportunity for all people? What's the link here? Because we know that, from the very beginning, and as you said, Tim, this is an ongoing almost 100-year discussion about the meaning of this clause. All right. And what's that going to look like in the end result? What does equal protection look like here? And there are those who are going to push back and, for a very long time and very intensely against this notion of affirmative action, because they say you cannot use race, all right, as a criterion to defeat racism, that is hypocritical and inconsistent to say that we're going to use race as a factor to battle racism. All right, race as a factor to benefit a subgroup in order to I think you know where I'm going here.
Sure, but isn't that the whole Yick Wo case? You have these laws, they're on their face, they're not discriminatory, but the effect, and that's I think the big, as I read it, that's the debate. Do we just look at the laws on their face? Are they, on its face neutral, or is the net effect of a law discriminatory? And that's why I really like that Yick Wo case, because it looks at the effects of a law and concludes that it is discriminatory against Chinese
launders, right? And I think what's more fascinating is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm wrong quite frequently, but Yick Wo is an example of self-enforcing nature of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, right? There's no statute that the court's dealing with in California, is there?
I think there was. They had to be made of. They couldn't be. I think the laws, they couldn't be made of wood. So there was a building code, I think, was the case.
But the statute itself didn't deal with race. We know that that's what the statute was intended to do, but it itself did not deal with race.
Correct. Neutral on its face, but discriminatory in its effect.
And again, Yick Wo goes to court on the Equal Protection Clause to make that argument there. And isn't that, Chris, help me out, isn't that the self-enforcing nature of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause?
Is it? Well, I don't know.
You didn't have an act of Congress. Let me put it that way. Did you have an act of Congress that Yick Wo was relying on?
No. He's relying on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The case, students, is Yick Wo versus Hopkins is the case we're referring to. Comes out of San Francisco, and Chinese, actually Americans at this point, but it doesn't matter, because, as I pointed out, all persons are entitled to due process of law. And so the law, as is written on its face, well, it's non-discriminatory, right? Kind of like, well, we're not stopping you from voting because you're black. We're stopping you from voting because you can't pass a literacy test.
Right.
Mike?
So,
Well, I just want to point out to the students, and please, y'all correct me if I'm wrong on this. In the application of the 14th Amendment from when it was passed until Brown, right? Yik Wo is an exception in terms of the 14th Amendment being used in a way in which, when you think about the historical context of which equal protection comes out of, it's being used in a way that we would expect, oh yeah, that aligns with why we passed that. I mean, all the other cases that we've been bringing up, Cruikshank, Slaughterhouse, Plessy, we can go down the line. The 14th Amendment was not applied in that way. So I think Yik Wo it's an important case, but for me, it's an outlier in this 100-year period. I just wanted to point that out to the students.
I think the first people to use the 14th Amendment as a protection was a railroad company, right? With the Chicago Burlington Quincy Railroad case. I mean, they're arguing that, you know, they're being deprived of something. It's like, well, I'm not sure this is how, but the court says, yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
All right. So go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
I just wanted to wrap up my thought to your question. You know, why do we need affirmative action programs? Kurt Vonnegut wrote a great story one time. It's called Harrison Bergeron. And in the story, I got to shout out to my Indy native, right? Kurt Vonnegut. And in the story, there's a guy and it's called the Handicapper General. Now, he was really ripping on communism, but in the story, the Handicapper General, you know, he puts different burdens on people to try and promote equality. You know, Vonnegut being Vonnegut. And for students, if you've not read any Kurt Vonnegut, shame on you and shame on your English teachers. But anyway, but the thing is like, okay, we've ended slavery, we fought a civil war, we have a 14th Amendment, everybody's equal, now go. Well, no, it doesn't work that way, partly because of the failure of Reconstruction, right? There's a failure within Reconstruction to follow through on the promises of Reconstruction. And so now the idea that these people that had been enslaved, deprived of education, in many cases, after Reconstruction's over, because during Reconstruction, there is and up to about 1877, there is a move forward. But the idea is that now you're going to be equal to folks in society. That's just not the case, because they're already 100 yards behind the starting line. And so there's a reason for the idea that we have to open avenues to people, that those avenues have been closed. And again, we're not just talking African Americans, we're talking women here as well.
So let's delve into the legal elements to this, because the students are asked to address Brown versus Board in 1954, and check me if I'm wrong on my pronunciation here. Is it Grutter versus Bollinger or Grutter? Grutter versus Bollinger, 2003. They're asked to evaluate how those cases are used in the Students for Fair Admissions case here. And so it seems to me the key question, Professor Williams, is does the Equal Protection Clause forbid racial classification itself, or only racial classification that entrenches historical subordination? What are your thoughts?
I would rephrase the question a little bit. I would say that, I would rephrase it this way. Racial classifications are automatically suspect. Like if you start classifying laws and saying some privilege for this race, some privilege for that race, immediately the court has said, because the Equal Protection Clause, you have to give us a compelling reason as to why you're doing it. And then you have to tell us that your reason, you have a narrowly tailored way of doing it. That's the way I read. I mean, Brown. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
And that's Grutter, right? That's what O'Connor articulates.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, Grutter is building off of the Bakke case from '78, right? And what the Harvard case does, the Students for Fair Admissions does, is under the Roberts Court, based on this decision, the reason that had been used by universities from '78 up through 2022 was that, well, our compelling interest is that we want a diverse student body because it's good for education. It's good because we know that folks who go through higher ed are going to be the privileged leaders of our society. So we want to make sure that we have as diverse a group coming through as possible, getting this education. And what the Harvard case, what Roberts basically says is, he says that's a commendable goal, but it's not compelling enough. And you Harvard and you most universities, you can't construct a way of implementing this that's going to be narrow enough. What he says is basically, how do you know when you have enough diversity? What is the point? And if you have no end game, and what Grutter gave us was language from O'Connor that said, there's going to be an end game here. This is going to end. She said 2028, basically. She said 25 years. And the court latches onto that and says, we've already said it, it's going to end. It's time for it to end, right? So that's the legal analysis. And what I think the students should do with this is just, these arguments are an opportunity for you to just kind of, I don't know, use your own logic and reasoning. Like, we're all adults, we're smart people. Is this a compelling reason that we should have a race-based classification? And if not, why not? And then, okay, can universities do this in a way that's narrowly tailored? The court has basically said no. And unless you're a military institution, which I'm happy we can get into that. That was in footnote 4. Fascinating exception, right? But unless you're a military institution, they pretty much kind of closed the door for universities to do it. So I would say that the answer to your question is, I think there are 2 exceptions to this. I think if there was a college of where there's evidence that they discriminated against someone because of their race recently, and then that person can say, you have set up a policy of discriminating and you should have an affirmative action program because the race I'm part of was discriminated against, the court would say, okay, possibly. Or if it's a safety issue, the other big exception to this is in prisons. There's some precedent there that the courts have said you can segregate prisons based on race for a short time being for safety reasons, due to racial rioting, basically. So you can't depend on societal discrimination. You can't depend on, in my reading, historical context of how we should be thinking about this. It's fascinating, students, to read the majority opinion and the concurring opinion. There's virtually no discussion of the passage of the 14th Amendment, the Freedmen's Bureau. It's not until you get to the dissent with Sotomayor, and all of a sudden she and the other dissenters have become these sort of historical originalists who are looking back and saying, wait a minute, there's a context for why we have the Equal Protection Clause. It wasn't just to say, it's a new race, we're all equal, let's go. It was to say we need to take into account slavery and other things. Sorry, David, you were going to say something.
Well, again, so you do a great service to Grutter. I guess where I ran into a wall was Roberts in the majority and Thomas in a previous in a dissent in Grutter. All right. They argue that what they're doing in their opposition to their constitutional opposition to the policy of affirmative action is they're upholding the principles of Brown.
Yes.
All right. That Brown, the intent of Brown was to erase race consciousness.
Yes.
All right, was to remember, again, and kind of building off of King, to push for a colorblind society. There, and so it sets up that there's this debate on the Brown decision's understanding of equal protection. Is that what I'm understanding here?
Yeah, but I think to me it's kind of apples and oranges. Brown is about policies that were in place that were saying you can only go to certain schools based on your race, right? And as we talked about it, I think in a previous episode, Thurgood Marshall and a lot of the NAACP, they wanted to make a different argument. They wanted to say, well, it's not about the separation. It's about that we're supposed to get equal funding here. And the issue is the Black schools aren't getting equal funding, right? But that argument is ditched. And it's like this, no, it's inherently going to be unequal if you do it. That to me is different than asking the question, okay, should we as a society and in our politics should we recognize our history, recognize that there are some individuals who are part of groups that have had more privilege, and that the only way we're going to get to equality is if we open our eyes to that we're not colorblind, that we open our eyes to that and we adopt some policies to try to level this playing field that hasn't been leveled since the Civil War, right? So I see Brown and Grutter as they're both using the 14th Amendment, but they're coming at a different issue. So I think the way the question is posed actually is a little confusing to try to get your head around it, because I do think that they're trying to get it different issues, I guess.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming that you have your issues with Roberts trying to use Brown as a justification for the majority decision, or are you okay with that? Is there a logic of Roberts using Brown to justify the majority opinion?
No, I think there is a logic.
Okay.
I think there is. I mean, and this was going to be my final point on this, was just going to be, look, I think as Chris, I think I already said, like, the Reconstruction period was a failure, right? If we would have done what we could have done during Reconstruction, there was a whole group of people who were individually and substantially harmed by slavery and then harmed by Black codes. It would have been very easy to pass laws like the Freedoms Bureau and to say, we need to pass laws, affirmative action laws, because this group of people who are alive today have been harmed. But when you miss that historical opportunity, right?
Yeah.
I can see Robert's argument. It says, no person shall be not denied equal protection, right? We don't really have a name for what affirmative action is trying to do. To me, it's trying to get at, it's a word that it's getting overused right now, maybe, but it's about privilege to me. And you know, sociologists, I think, can teach us a lot about how you understand privilege. And the notion of privilege, as I was just kind of saying, privilege is always relational. So as a white person, I am privileged because of my relation with other groups. Like, I'm privileged because I'm seen as white, right? And there is a history in this country of having privilege when you're white. That's a different issue to get at once you get past the immediate harm that's been done from slavery and from Black codes. Maybe you could have even made the argument right after Jim Crow, right? But those policies weren't enacted. You're looking at me like I'm not making sense, but I think I'm making sense. It sounds like I am to myself.
No, you're making sense. Tim,
Yeah, I looked over these decisions. I had it was tough, frankly.
I didn't think you had anything up in your library behind you there that would be in the 20th century. So that's nice. You
Oh yeah, well, that's the other bookshelves. They're off in the corner. But I was stunned at the fact, because as I think about the Bakke case, I'm glad we mentioned this. As I understand it, Powell wrote the decision and said race could be a factor amongst others.
Mm-hmm.
So I frankly don't get why this question comes out of naivete, I guess. I don't understand why these cases got to the court. They were using race amongst other, because I mean, I wrote down these like 5-step process that Harvard used to get to their final decision of admissions. And yes, race was in there, but it was a factor amongst many others. So somebody answered,
well, let me jump on it first, because Mike talked about how nebulous our definition of affirmative action is. The way I understood it is that these positive actions, affirmative actions by government, were intended to deal with the legacy of racism, all right, was to remedy the effects of past discrimination. And even in Bakke, there is discussion that this is a policy that will be temporary in nature. Now, how temporary is, of course, becomes a key question. But to remedy the effects of past discrimination means that there is this legacy. So from slavery, from Jim Crow, that today's children and today's African Americans are still feeling the effects of that past, that history. And so we, the government, are going to take positive action to remedy that. But there is going to come a time, all right, in which, in Johnson's, metaphor of the race, there is going to come a time in which everybody's lined up and it's a fair playing field. And at that point, the federal government will step out, all right, and we can all hold hands and sing "We Are the World." That's my understanding and explanation there. I don't know. Chris has a grin on his face, so.
Well, no, I was the "We Are the World." I thought was pretty funny, but I think the term that Mike mentioned a couple times is really important, and this is this may help you, Tim, and or may not. And students, this is a tough thing to get your arms around, kind of like "We Are the World," is the term narrowly tailored. What does that actually mean in a legal sense when you're taking race into account in an application process? And as Tim mentioned, the 5-step process, what Harvard was doing seemed to narrowly tailor the application, or the race on college admittance or college applications. So what you start to see is, a court that is hostile to that very thing. And yet they're saying, wait, it's going to be okay in some places. And honestly, there are other places that has been okay. I mean, segregation based on gender has been okay, even in some public schools. Because I don't know if you guys remember this a few years back, where, especially at the middle school level, they were segregating out boys from girls in math classes in public schools, just because of the learning environments created by that age group, where people are in the hormonal process, so to speak. So that was okay as well. But that concept of narrowly tailored, and I think for students grappling with this question, that's something that you want to make sure you have a good handle on in terms of specific examples.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong on this. My understanding of the Bakke decision, there were 4 justices who said that what Berkeley was doing, their compelling interest was to address societal discrimination. They only had 4 votes. There were 4 that said no. Powell comes in and says, you can do this. You can have a quota system, but you can do this if your aim is to create diversity. So as Roberts points out in the majority opinion, he says, look, the dissent is pretending like societal discrimination has been something this court has leaned upon. He says, that's never been a majority of the court. At one point, he says kind of flippantly, like, a majority means you're not the majority. Like, you've never had that, you've never won that argument. So he then says, the issue is diversity. And he basically says, diversity is a great goal. It's not compelling enough for us to have racial classifications. Like Harvard, even if it's a 5-step process, even if it's one factor, it's not something you can do. Now, military institutions, he says, we're not going to decide on that because there may be some reasons why it's important for you to do it, right? So to me, it's this idea of diversity, right? The court is really like, we can no longer, well, we couldn't do it in California anyways because it was because of propositions, but a University of Wisconsin can't say that we want to diversify the student body, so we're going to be looking for that. You can't do that anymore. The only way you can get at that is if a student puts into their admissions essay, if they tell a story about how their race has been a factor in their educational journey, then the admission office will know that it's race, but then they have to be very careful because there's all these watchdogs now. There's going to be all this litigation making sure that people are not trying to get around this new ruling.
Well,
and isn't it?
I want to throw that out there for the students. We mentioned Grutter a couple of times, but don't forget there was a case that went with that, and that was also Gratz.
Yep.
So Gratz is that undergrad, and the way the process was set up at the University of Michigan and Gratz was that if you could list a minority status on your application, you would get more points toward your point total. They threw that out, and that's not narrowly tailored enough. But in their opinion in Grutter, and you guys can help me out because I've not looked at it, Grutter opinion in a while, but this was for law school, right? Wasn't this for law school?
Yeah.
And I think part of the idea was that at that level, at that specialty level, not necessarily undergrad at the University of Michigan, which is what it got 500,000 people or something like that, the UM, I don't know. go blue, right? But at the law school is it's a, I don't know how you would describe it, but it's a tougher thing to get into. So the idea of diversity at that level, there is an interest in the law school to make sure that there's a diverse group of people within the law school. So the idea that, there, I think, if you compare Gratz and Grutter, the court in Grutter said, yeah, actually, we think at this level, diversity is not necessarily a bad thing.
Right, and so I kind of want to jump over for a moment the other topic of precedent, and let's run with this diversity thing, because again, even in Bakke, Mike, you're absolutely right. But there is, I think, an ideal assumption by a plurality on the court that we will implement these policies for a few decades, all right, which will then remedy the system, and then it will happen organically. And it seems to me what this court has now said is we are at that point, all right, in which diversity happens organically, i.e. the military, i.e. the professional sports programs, other areas of society. So we no longer need these programs to provide some force behind this push for diversity, because they are happening organically, which was the intent of affirmative action. We've achieved that goal. All right. O'Connor said 25 years. It's a little bit sooner, but we've achieved that goal. So it's now time to set that aside. Chris, what do you think about that?
I honestly, I think that's bovine fecal matter, to say it politely, because I mean, my goodness, look at what still exists in our society today. I mean, look at the racism that still exists in our society today. We were just talking about this in my class just today, so this is fresh in my mind. We were just talking about the resistance to getting involved in World War II with the meeting of the Boom Party in Madison Square Garden, where you have 20,000 Americans dressed up as Nazis. They weren't dressed as Nazis; they were Nazis, and they're saying "Heil Hitler" as they're doing the Pledge of Allegiance in Madison Square Garden, 20,000 people. So the idea is, and I asked my students, I said, have you guys ever heard of Unite the Right rally? And they had not. And I said, that was your lifetime. So I had to explain to them how these ideas of these ideas of racism have not gone by the wayside. So the idea is that, yeah, are we a more diverse society? Yes. Are we a more accepting society? Yes. But do we know that racism and sexism still exist? Absolutely. So there needs to be legal protections still to protect people from those things.
I'm sorry, I guess I got to push back, Chris. The question here is not whether racism exists or whether we have racists in society. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have a First Amendment which is going to allow racism
David,
to exist and racism. All right. The question is government.
No, right? Shelby County versus Holder. What do? We get rid of the pre-clearance for places that have traditionally prohibited people from voting because of their race. And as Justice Ginsburg said in her dissent, it's like throwing away your umbrella just because it's not raining. And so when we look at the idea of moving away from allowing universities to have a narrowly tailored idea for race or gender in their application process, we don't need it because now we've had a Black president, so clearly we're a post-racial society, when we know that's BS. And so we know that there are government policies happening across the country that are trying to prohibit people of color from voting.
When was Shelby County? What year was that decided?
2013.
10 years ago.
2013. And what has Black voter turnout been in 2016 and 2020? Higher or lower than before?
I don't know.
It's higher.
Yeah.
All right. There's greater voter turnout since Shelby, even with all what some would call these barriers. All right. And so I don't know. I mean, again, I may agree with you,
So when Black people overcome the barriers, put more barriers at the government, that's your point, David, the government. So when Black people overcome more barriers that have been put in front of them by local state governments, so clearly, well, yeah, there's no problem. So because their voter turnout's greater?
I don't know that I'm buying your bait and switch, Chris, to go from admissions policies to voting issues.
No,
Uh,
I was
there-
using that's not a bait and switch. David asked me about government policies, so I'm talking
right,
about government policies that are put in place to
right.
keep people of certain ethnicities from participating in the process. So there
Well,
are
but I think,
policies put in place that
yeah,
are actually designed to keep people of color from participating. And so the idea that we're going to rely on
right.
voter turnout as well, that clearly is not a problem.
I guess uh, our so much of our diversity discussion in our country has been driven by race issues, racism. But uh, I think in the future, other isms, other than race, are going to come to the forefront. And um, so to always frame, I'm intrigued by all of these admissions policies that factor in race, and I think, my estimation, it's totally legit. See Baki. But I think in the future, the admissions policy, if we're going to continue talking about admissions policy, I think other configurations of what diversity means other than race is going to become a factor. And I don't know how the court's going to handle that either.
Well, I mean, when you think about, financial aspects, I mean, really the color line is more green now than it was black and white.
Right.
And how do you
Right.
and I think about, I go back to the case, the Fisher case out of Texas, right? There was also an affirmative action case, and how University of Texas came up with
Yeah.
their policy, which that young girl, and I think Amy Fisher, and that was a whole series of cases because they got sent back, and but to get into UT, if you were in the top 15% of your class where you went to school, you
Yeah.
were guaranteed admission. So that was actually created a more level playing field for not only on the basis of race, but based on urban and rural, based on schools that may be a Title IX school. So it actually helps try to level that playing field. But there becomes an
Yeah.
issue with that in terms of if you go back and again multiple rulings, and I don't know that, I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but the idea was you went to because you could go to a wealthy suburban school that offers all kinds of advanced placement, dual credit, very good teachers, all kinds of stuff, versus kids that are going to maybe a rough urban school or a poor rural school. They can't offer these things, and those people on that process for admissions is very hard to compete. So the University of
Yeah.
Texas said, if you're in the top 15%, I think it was, of your graduating class, you're in. And Amy Fisher didn't get in, and she didn't like that, and so she sued.
Well, because the same is true in California, in the University of California system. If you finish in the top 12% of your class, you are guaranteed admission into the University of California system. However, that's a system. The big debate is not University of California Merced. It is not University of California Santa Cruz. It is University of California Los Angeles and Cal. That's where the arguments are fought. All right. The same thing in the Texas system. There's multiple UTs. All right. But the debate was into UT. What's the flagship? University of Texas at Austin. That's the flagship, and that's where she was denied admission to and was upset because of this policy. But that policy, to be quite honest, seems to be the fairest that we can possibly come up with to try to level the playing
Well, I think
field there.
that I mentioned that too, because that goes back to what Tim was talking about. Obviously, it moves away just from the concept of race, because it talks, and I think again, money. It's the idea of because the access to financial wherewithal certainly boosts your chances of perhaps getting into a better school. So when you start talking about poverty, kids that grow up in poverty and the struggle for them to get into schools, I think that those policies actually help. I agree, David, those policies that help level that playing field.
Well, and I think, some jurisdictions are fighting that next fight, Tim, and Chris, and that is getting rid of legacy admissions. The University of California is I think, on the edge of doing that. I forget, there are some other universities are doing that is just because of the status of your parents should not give you an extra bump in admissions into these premier universities, kind of thing. So I do want to change direction for the kids' sake and for ours here, and Tim, and that is this notion. The question kind of takes this really interesting, I don't know if it's a 90-degree turn from from affirmative action to, okay, let's now go to this legal concept of precedent. And we know that this current court has tremendously has shown a hostility towards a precedent, whether it's First Amendment religion, Second Amendment, reproductive freedom. They're having a fun time ignoring stare decisis and overturning precedent here. And it seems, in looking at their justification, that the primary reason that they argue is that the previous decision was badly or wrongly decided on a constitutional basis. What I'm wondering, Professor Moore, is that a legitimate reason to overturn or to ignore precedent? And is it the only justification? Because I had a hard time finding other justifications.
Well, sure. Overturning a bad decision or wrongly. Now, the devil's always in the details of that, because I guess I'm going to glibly say badly or wrongly is in the eye of the beholder. So I guess for me, I don't get too apoplectic with overturning precedent for a couple of reasons. Most notably, because I tend to look at laws and evolutionary process. Now, and that also opens up another debate, which I'm willing to concede. Is it progressive evolution, or can it have regression? And I think that's a fair discussion, whether some of the more recent overturnings of precedent, I think on one side of the aisle, they're going to perceive that as regressing. That's not progressive organic evolution of law. That's like a return to, the dark days. So I guess, to me, I think it's absolutely important to overturn precedent if it's a crappy decision. Go ahead. But at a philosophical level, I would say really it's kind of the nature of how our system works. And sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they get overturning Plessy. So, and I know Chris is going to chime in that Plessy wasn't overturned, and that's another that's another discussion. But I guess
take that page.
Yeah. I think it is important to overturn, but the devil's in the details of what's badly or wrongly decided. And then that I was digging a little around. I get, this is hilarious to me. I ran across this article that talks about, well, there are super precedents and then there are precedents. Now I find that, I mean, I love that because that's in my zone of squishy, I mean, so students, I mean, I don't know much about this, but it was interesting to me that legal scholars are using that kind of language to describe, well, there are some precedents that are sacrosanct. And I think the Roe decision, may enter into that sacrosanct category for some people, that's an uber or super precedent that shouldn't be messed with because it deals with a right. So I guess my answer is, yeah, overturn bad decisions or wrongly decided, but there's a debate as to what that actually means.
Well, is there any other criteria the court uses to overturn precedent besides, they got it wrong?
Well, they do it at a federal level if they perceive a lower court got it wrong. So the SCOTUS does it. So that's overturning, crappy or wrongly decided decisions at the appellate or at the circuit court level. So there's that. I think it gets a little more tricky if they're dealing with coordinate branches when they have to make decisions. I don't know. I mean, I'll defer to Mike and Chris on, is there any other criteria to overturn?
Well, is Brown, and again, well, not, I don't want to, but let's assume we'll accept that the 8th grade textbook, Chris, that Brown overturns part of Plessy. It doesn't overturn all of Plessy, but it deals with part of Plessy there.
Oh, great. You concede that to him, but you want it to me. Great. Okay, I get it. I get it.
That's right. We're only an hour-long program.
Well, I understand that Dave knows more about law than I do. So
let's grant that. So is that action in Brown? Is that because Plessy is seen as wrongly decided, or is it that society has changed? The role of education has changed. We must look at these clauses in light of those changes, which to me would be a different criteria for overturning a precedent. And is that a legitimate criteria to you, Chris? That listen, the world's changed, and we have to read these clauses of the Constitution in light of the world we actually live in, not one that existed 100 years ago.
I think it's a little of both. I think, I'm going to go and channel my inner Jimmy Madison and say, you got to look at the words first. If you're trying to interpret the Constitution, look at the words first. So you got to start with that. But I think also, why should we limit ourselves to the words of these old dead white slave owners? That's another way to think about it too. So I think we have to live in the time that we live, and I'll borrow a line from another famous old white slave owner, is Thomas Jefferson. Life belongs in usufruct to the living, and so the idea is from Plessy to Brown, as we've noted on many occasions, there are no new laws. There are no new amendments. It's simply a new court, a new time period in society. We do the same thing from Bowers v. Hardwick to Lawrence v. Texas.
Yeah.
So and that's even a shorter amount of time. So, when you look at these cases, we have no new laws, no new amendments, but what has changed? Society has changed. And so, we've wrestled with this before, should the court care about society, or should they simply stick to the original meaning of the law? And of course, we know with certain justices, they're very situational in their interpretation and their how they approach certain things. So I do think that the law should be interpreted as a way to reflect where we are as a society. I'm not sure if that's answering your question,
No,
but
it does. So, Mike, I'm going to see how nimble you still are as a non-boomer here.
I can guarantee he's more nimble than the three of us.
That's probably true. I do want to just do a check-in on potential impact here. I think we've kind of talked about one, and this is this statewide plan of, hey, if you graduate at this level in your senior at a high school, you're guaranteed admission into a system. I don't know if all states have systems like Texas and California and I guess Michigan. I just don't know enough about all 50 states. But what about this? I'm just curious about your legal reading here. So we have an admission policy. Let's create one to the University of California that we get to look at where you live. All right. And so we look for geographic representation. We get to look at socioeconomic status, and we get to look at family history, and we'll weigh those things. Race has nothing to do with it. All right. If those were the three criteria, along with grades and some other things, to get into the University of California, would that pass constitutional muster, in your opinion, under this court?
I think it might. I think Roberts made it pretty clear in this decision that as a warning to universities, you can't do indirectly what we're saying, what we're outlawing you to do directly. So I think if a university did that in a way where they were sincerely interested in first-gen students and sincerely interested in different zip codes and geographic representation, yeah, I think it would pass constitutional muster. I think there's going to be challenges because I think that, as soon as a university says, you know what, we're going to start doing more recruiting in XYZ cities that are all predominantly Black cities, right? I imagine there might be a claim saying, hey, wait a minute, can we get some, we're going to sue you and we want some discovery to find out what really went into this decision, because you can't try to get certain racial groups to apply to your university in an indirect way. Now, the way, the way privilege and lack of privilege works in the United States, you can get at um, the lack of racial privilege by looking at zip codes and, like you said, in different demographics. There's something I'll put in the resources, this website called Opportunity Atlas that the students should really look at. It's from the U.S. Census Bureau put it together. You put in your zip code and it will tell you, by virtue of being born in a certain zip code, what is your median. It will tell you what is your median income likely to be at age 35. What is the likely incarceration rate? And it's fascinating. You look at your zip code and, based on, like, I looked at my own address, 2 miles away, the median income goes down by $10,000 just by virtue of just being born in a different zip code. So all this, like, we can get at this stuff, right? Because of all this past discrimination and stuff. But I think universities have to be super careful. I think it would pass constitutional muster, but I think you'd have to do it in a very earnest way and make sure that your legal counsel is really paying attention to how you're doing it, because I think you're likely to be in a lawsuit.
So here's your are you nimble question.
Oh, I thought that was it.
No, that wasn't the
Yeah, I
nimble.
thought
That's the warm up. That's the stretching.
That was the warm up.
I thought that was the curveball. I thought it didn't look like a curveball.
Oh, no.
It was just like
no.
fastball.
Well, and again, I don't think this is probably my slider that just never slid, and I think it's still circumnavigating the earth from the last guy.
Hang it.
But what about other nations? I mean, we're the language of colonizer, colonized, imperial, yada yada yada. That's so prevalent today. How do other nations, all right, deal? I mean, England, France. I mean, obviously, most of Western Europe that have seen increases in non-white populations. All right, how do they deal with this issue? And I'm sorry, I probably should have, forewarned you about that.
No,
but,
I don't. I can look up stuff on Europe. I do have a South Africa example because that's my go-to.
Yeah.
I mean, think about South Africa in the 1990s as being in the equivalent of our Reconstruction period, right? Brand new constitution, granting brand new rights to a group of people who didn't have rights before, political rights. And in their constitution, they have an equality section. And it says, everyone is equal before the law and has the right to equal protection and the benefit of the law. So that sounds pretty familiar. To promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or category of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. So in their clause on equality, they carved out an exception that said, look, if you're being discriminated against, or you have been discriminated against, we can write legislation to the effect of making sure that doesn't happen. So what that's done in South Africa is it's opened up the pathway for a lot of affirmative action in the business population and in the university sector. So I think it's, like I was trying to say earlier, it's maybe a lack of imagination in 1868 that I don't think we can blame Bingham and others for. I think it's a lack of us having the right language. And it feels like we're kind of constrained by this constitutional language now, where I think there's probably a majority of citizens who think, yeah, we probably do need to do more for certain segments of the population. And constitutionally, again, like I said, I can see how Roberts and others will read the Equal Protection Clause and says, look, it says every person equally protected. You can't carve out racial class. In an ahistorical, abstract kind of logical way, I see it. But I don't think the court should be looking at these things in an abstract, ahistorical way. But in this case, that's what they said they were going to do. You could check in on their Second Amendment decision and see how they deal with that, because they do it a little differently.
Well, gentlemen, we've gone over our kind of our hour line here a little bit, and so if we could,
have we hit the hour for, like, this whole spring? I don't know that we've ever hit the hour mark.
we try. We we take affirmative action to attempt to do so on this. So Gentlemen, last thoughts, recommendations to Unit 5 students who are dealing with the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, possibly for the first time in a hearing. Here, Chris?
Gosh, I could go back to the idea of what narrowly tailored means, and why has the court been willing to grant exceptions, say, for military schools, as well as I think in the headlines, a school in Virginia, high school in Virginia. So understand that can and should it be used. We're obviously the question deals with education and affirmative action, and clearly because of the Supreme Court case, and it mentions two others that deal with education. But understand there are other cases that deal with affirmative action as well. I was Ricci versus DeStefano in 2009 is a very interesting case. So you might want to go back and take a look at that case, though I don't know if in your follow-up which way this could go. Obviously, you can see this is still a very charged topic, and don't be afraid if to stick. I say this a lot on my advice. Stick by your guns, make good arguments why you believe affirmative action policies need to be in place, or why do affirmative action policies not need to be in place, and just be ready to push on it. But understand what the narrowly tailored means, because if you can figure that out, then you're halfway home, because I'm still trying to figure that out. I think the court is still trying to figure that out as well.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I think Chris's thoughts there about really maybe the entire discussion should be about narrowly tailored, because I think a lot of the potential follow-ups that you may get at the nationals will kind of be, no matter how it's phrased, it will be about narrowly tailored. As I was listening to all this, I couldn't help but think that the court, the court kind of inserted itself as the referee in all of this. I wonder whether Caroline Products footnote 4 is relevant here. I know that was kind of a rights case that they were, actually it was more of a commercial case, but when they said, the court in the future is going to take a lot more attention to discrete and insular minorities that may have been, discriminated against in our society. And I think from that, the court has become this referee about minorities that would make an appeal to the court to make a decision on these kinds of things. And I don't know, it strikes me as the current court doesn't want to be that referee for some reason. And, and I think politics does enter into that. But I think thinking about that 1930s case, about what is the meaning of these more searching judicial scrutiny, I think is the phrasing from that footnote. Is the court really the best spot to make these balls and strikes calls on narrowly tailored type issues? So I would have students think about, I would reiterate Chris's point about narrowly tailored and ultimately why the court is the place for this. And maybe it's better because right now Congress wouldn't be able to do anything. So,
Mike?
Yeah, my suggestion is maybe kind of obvious given our target audience of the kind of students we're talking to. But I think in some cases you can get away with a question like this, maybe skimming the Supreme Court decision or reading an article about it. I would really encourage you to sit down, take your time, get a cup of coffee. It's over 200 pages. Read through the majority, concurring, and dissenting opinions and ask yourself questions about interpretations of history, interpretations of the role of government. And I would have you do that, as Dave was kind of saying at the beginning. Maybe some of your team sits down and does this with the Harvard case. Someone do that with Brown and someone do that with Grutter. And I think it'd be really powerful if you could really articulate that you have read through the opinions in dissent and you really have an opinion. Like, Robert said this on page X and X, and the response by Sotomayor was this, and I tend to think that this is really more to the point. I think that'd be really powerful, and I think these decisions lend themselves to that, because these justices really, they're taking the gloves off. They really kind of go at each other in these decisions. And so I think it's worth your while to look at them.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Students and teachers, just one last time, good luck in your testimony at national finals on this topic. Hope you're having an epiphany after epiphany about the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Please let your Unit 4 classmates know that in our next session, we'll be addressing their question and topic on direct democracy, initiative, referendum, and recall, and why California is a nutty state. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye bonds.